Hello everyone, welcome back to another mini album reviews video. I've got 10 albums that I'm talking about today in short form reviews, although this time I'm going into a little bit more detail on them than I usually do for these mini reviews. It often depends. There's some episodes where I'm, giving a little bit more depth in my reviews, where it's a little bit less of a mini review, even though they're all still fairly short. And then there's the other ones where I just very briefly go, yep, here's my really quick thoughts on the album. And a lot of the time it's kind of mixed, where some albums I'll have more to say about than others. In this video, for the most part, I've actually gone a little bit more in depth about all the albums, but they are still mini reviews, so I'm not going to be going on for too long about each one. Actually, in my script that I have written for this, it's at around 10,000 words in total, so approximately 1,000 words for each album that I have written. Now, I don't always read everything exactly word for word off the script, but I try to follow it as much as I can for the most part. And so that's definitely more words than I usually do for these mini reviews. And let me just say right now, I know I'm rambling a little bit, but I am going to be going away soon, which means to prepare for that, I want to get a bunch of reviews out. And after this video, that means the next few are probably going to be a lot more brief and a lot quicker and just not going into as much detail as I do in this one. And even this one, I don't go into that much detail. They are mini reviews once again. But with all that out of the way, let me talk about these albums, and these are just my personal opinions on these albums. Feel free to agree or disagree with me in the comments section. I might say some negative things in certain ones, others I might be more positive toward, but it's just my personal opinion at the end of the day, so, take it with a grain of salt in that regard, but I am trying to do some genuine commentary on these albums. So, I won't say don't take it seriously, I'll just say take it with a grain of salt, or maybe the better way to put it is just take it as my personal thoughts and feelings on these albums. You do not have to agree with me. Anyway, with all that being said, let's get the reviews started with... This is my first time listening to an album by the Twilight Sad, and it's their first album in over 7 years. I admittedly haven't thought about this band that much, even though their name seemed vaguely familiar, and then I realized that the reason why I recognized the name is probably because Martin Doherty of Church's fame used to be a touring member back in the day. But now I'm pretty sure it's just a duo consisting of James Graham and Andy McFarlane with 2 more touring members. And honestly, the vibe I get is a lot different from what I was expecting. The vocals almost remind me a little bit of Poets of the Fall, based on the small amount of music I've heard from that band. I should really listen to them more. But musically, it's more shoegazy, but with a lot of synthesizers that are very prominent as well. Funnily enough, almost like that of an early Church's album, with the first moment where I can really notice that being on the 3rd track, Attempt a Crash Landing theme. I can see why Martin was touring with this band. Right from the opening track with its shoegazy take on glossy synth rock, the melodies can really soar, and I had a feeling I might be in for a really special album. And yeah, honestly, this went way past my expectations, leading to a legitimately great album that blends genres incredibly well and manages to pull it all together in what is, to me, a weird kind of borderline conceptual album that manages to convey so much emotion in such simple ways. Although I'll discuss that a little bit later, because I first want to talk about the absolutely kick-ass instrumentation and awesome production on this album. I really love the punchy drums on songs like Inhospitable Hospital, Dead Flowers, Waiting for the Phone Call, and the synth work is well executed on this album. And it's especially impressive because I don't typically think of these kinds of high-pitched glossy synths as being a part of shoegazy dream pop / alt rock, but they managed to actually pull it off. And I'm not even sure I can describe how. Maybe it's because they make these songs feel so much larger than life and put emphasis on the huge hooks and melodies, and the shoegazy sounds are emphasized in a way that almost adds to the heaviness of it, leading to the feeling of some huge, soaring alternative metal album, but without actually going there all the way into metal. And it's a vibe that I think they pull off impressively well. I mean, look at a song like The Ceiling Underground, where the synths cut through really well to really bring more impact for an already powerful musical presentation, with the crunch of the guitar and the drums which sound great in the mix, and the mostly simple rhythm of them is perfectly placed on this song. And the closing track is also an excellent moment on this album, where even after everything else, I did not know this album had such an explosive moment in it musically. And it's a fantastic way to end the album. One of a few moments where this is pretty much post-punk, and I'm amazed at how well they pull this off. And then lyrically, there are some interesting themes too, including what I see as some complicated themes of loneliness and the ways that it can present itself in many different ways. Waiting for the phone call is heartbreaking, and the kind of comfort the narrator seeks from this one person while trying to conceal their struggles from everyone else. And the specific imagery of the song is absolutely haunting, especially when paired with a perfect instrumentation for this kind of song. And I also find it kind of interesting how the request goes from Die With Me on that song to Dream With Me on the next song, where there's an overall feeling of not wanting to be alone, whatever that actually means. And on that note, there's also Inhospitable Hospital, which I personally read as a breakup song, but there's definitely a feeling of attachment too, where nobody likes either outcome. If I were to make a complaint about the album, though, I do think sometimes the guitars can overpower everything a little bit too much, and the vocals are too buried sometimes. I think in terms of overall sound quality and overall vibe, it's a huge accomplishment, but I do have my mixing complaints in parts of the album. But still, this is a pretty damn excellent genre-blending album, and it's one that completely caught me off guard. On paper, if I heard myself talking about it, I'm not sure I'd really want to give it a chance. And yet I'm so glad I did because it's absolutely awesome. And before I finish up this review, I do want to acknowledge I can see how some people might find this maybe a little relentlessly redundant in its repeating themes, and I could see how it might come across as fake deep or something like that. Trust me, I get it. And honestly, there's a part of me that thinks that maybe I'm only fascinated by the lyrics because I love the music on this project so much, and thus I feel like the lyrics add even more to the picture, and the music perfectly encapsulates the lyrical themes. But to me, this album represents the different ways we view loneliness, and tries to tackle all the angles of human connection, and the unfortunate reality that sometimes one person's gain is another person's pain. It's important I say it that way and not the other way around. And sometimes it's hard to know which sacrifices should be made to benefit everyone as well as possible. I could also absolutely be reading way too much into this, especially considering how much lyrical repetition there is, but I'm perfectly okay with acknowledging that. And when it all comes together this well with the poetry and the music, it's easily an 8 out of 10 for me, and I'm so glad I gave it a chance. Reminds me a little bit of You Never Know by Flying Colours in its sound and style. Might be similar to that band in general, I wouldn't know because I've only heard one album of theirs, which I do think is a great album, as is this one. And you know what? This album might be even better. But regardless, I'd highly encourage you to give this album a shot, even if I absolutely cannot guarantee that it'll click. In fact, like I said, I understand why it might not, but I certainly ended up loving this album. What a great surprise. Robyn is not one of those artists I really think about very often, and it kind of makes sense when I think about it, even though Dancing on My Own is a classic that everyone knows. For one, I have never listened to a Robyn album outside of this one, and I've also never really cared much for Dancing on My Own. Yeah, I know, add that to the list of my opinions that go against the general consensus, but it's just never really been a song that I've personally found all that special. Anyway, this is her first album in 7.5 years, but I don't have any context of her previous albums to really have much of an idea of what to expect going into this. Maybe next time she releases an album, whenever that is, then maybe I'll do more of a discography dive. We'll see. But what we got here is an album that feels kind of weird talking about. I mean, if you like the non-critic-like explanation of what it is, it's a very overtly sexual synth-pop album that does not shy away from getting very specific and talking about the sex acts she sings about all over this album. And musically speaking, it's sort of in the vein of Magdalena Bay, with a lot of the bassy synths in some of the vocals, but also reminds me a bit of Mühle in some of the glossier sounds and emotional glamour. And look, I'm not against this kind of thing at all. In fact, a lot of the time I can really enjoy an album like this, especially when the production can really create that sensual vibe that is also full of fun. I mean, it would make sense for this kind of album. And alright, I'll admit some of the production choices on this album do work for creating that vibe. The pulsating grooves on songs like Really Real and Talk to Me, the sensual vocal production of Blow My Mind, the really good synth and bass pairing of Sucker for Love, and that knocking percussion on that track, and one of the best examples on Dopamine, which could have been the best produced song here if not for a few sound effects that don't quite work. And I think most of this works as normal dance pop production too. If only all that could save this album from mediocrity. The problem is in the execution, in large part because of the writing, where after listening to it, I can absolutely see where the album got its title, and I don't really think the existential lyrics fit at all here. Instead of making a fun, sexy synth-pop record, it brings a bunch of questions about how real everything is, and really just paints it all in such a negative light, probably without even deliberately trying to. See, It Don't Mean a Thing is a really awkward album centerpiece that throws off any good messaging of the album, or at least turns any simplicity of it into dreadful slop created by the mindset. It just so happens to have one of the better hooks on the album. And look, about said mindset, well, life is weird and hard to fully understand, so I get having those kinds of questions on the album. And there's nothing wrong with making those part of an album about sex, or even the focal point of it. And look, I could mention how this album is, at least I think, trying to be sexy, and that the existential questioning doesn't even work for that vibe. But you know what? I can even see how that might have worked. Fuck, I've heard music like that I really love. But it feels like this album doesn't know where to stop with certain subjects like said questioning, and it leads to some weird moments like dopamine, where the possible reality of it is apparently contrasting the other possibility that it's just dopamine. Last time I checked, dopamine is real and can be released by real activities. And yeah, it is just one song, but it's representative of a lot of this album, where there isn't really a clear focus that's really emphasized by the writing, and a lot of the philosophical pondering just doesn't feel worthy of any kind of serious analysis, because there's nothing to it, and all it does is throw off the vibe. But the album runs into other problems as well. There's a bunch of moments with sound effects and mid-song interludes that throw off the pacing for me, like the phone call on the opening track, the vocal-like bass of Dopamine, or the more spoken vocals on Blow My Mind, which was some serious missed potential and might have sounded a lot better if the lyrics were, I don't know, something sexier than "Let me crush your scrumptious little face." And what the hell was that attempt at rapping on the title track? And while some of these melodies had potential, a lot of them just hit odd notes that don't quite flatter it, or just feel like they could have had more flexibility, leading to a lot of these hooks not popping off nearly as much as they could have. And all of this is a real shame, because I think there are seeds of a good album here, but the execution just couldn't pull it off. I think if you really love synthpop, you might really dig this, and I mostly like the production, even though there are absolutely some moments that could have been a bit more polished, and some instrumental choices were definitely not my favorite. But yeah, I can tell there's going to be an audience for this. I just wish I could really love it. I don't think it's terrible, and it's got a couple moments that were kinda cute, but it's only getting a 6 out of 10. I mostly get the appeal, but it's absolutely got its problems for me, and I just could not look past them all. Alright, so here's a new dance album from this New York City duo formed in 2022. It's their debut studio album, and in my last mini-review video, I said I was going to try and review this one, so here it is. And I'm going to be honest, this is not what I was expecting. I'm not sure why I was thinking this was going to be a lot heavier. Well, I guess I might have some idea. I guess if you want a bit of a side tangent, in my last mini-review video, there was another album by that band, Oath, or O-L-T-H, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, which I thought was this album because the similarities between said albums and duos are kinda eerie. See my last mini-review video for me to explain why. But in that same video, I also reviewed an album by Holy Fuck, a Canadian electronic band who I'd expected to be a lot heavier because I'd gotten them confused with Fucked Up, who are another Canadian band whose music is apparently a lot heavier. So I guess here's another album by a band with the word fuck in their name that's less heavy than I was expecting. I don't know, maybe it's really wrong of me to make all this seem connected, because it isn't really, as far as I know. But I don't know, maybe just for some reason in my mind I was like, hey, I guess this is probably a heavier album because of a couple other albums that, I don't know. I'm kind of going on and on now about stuff that doesn't really make any sense. Back to the review of the album. I'm a bit conflicted on this album. For starters, I do like a lot of the production, with the crisp percussion and synths that pair nicely together, and the vocals have about the right amount of emphasis in the mix. In terms of specific moments in that regard, I'd point to the opening track, as well as Lonely and I Like It Like That, and even Play Me, even though the edited vocals with all the repetition is kind of obnoxious. I'll still acknowledge the good production of that song, though. But I'm not as big a fan of the vocal delivery. It's the kind of thing that could have worked in a different context, where I don't really want to make the wet leg comparison because this is much more the vibe to do that kind of thing with the borderline spoken word delivery, and it's not quite as in your face as wet leg are, which is part of the reason I think this is better than that wet leg album I reviewed last year. But it's still not really my thing. I guess a better comparison might be dry cleaning, except the singer here actually sounds more interested in the songs being sung. So why is it not clicking for me? Well, maybe this could have worked, and I could have gotten behind the vocal style more if the songwriting felt like it had a bit more to it. But most of this just feels kind of bland and not all that exciting. These songs feel very designed to be catchy, which I think they mostly succeed at, but it doesn't mean I'd want these to come on if I'm trying to party. A lot of it is based on repetition, which can work, and it doesn't even feel super overly repetitive. But when the melodies and hooks aren't particularly strong, then I'd kind of like a bit more evolution throughout the album. As it is, I'm just kind of wondering what makes this worth going back to compared to other better dance albums. So let me know in the comments, because to me, this is not it. And regarding the lyrics, well, I don't really have that much to say, nor do I think the lyrics are really the main point of the album. Mostly just horny dance floor anthems, designed to enhance the vibe without aiming for any real depth or song meanings, which is fine, but I'd want the music to actually be interesting to fit said vibe. And to me, it's just not. Oh, and then there's also the song, If You Want to Party, Come Over to My House, which not only sounds like a bad house song that could have come out years ago and been infamous had it been a big hit, and has some of the weaker production on this album too, but it's also basically the same concept as Sam Hunt's House Party, another song I absolutely can't stand, with its idea of, hey, let's have a party, but we're not actually gonna party at all, wink wink. And this song is arguably just as bad. Drake could probably make a better house song than this. And yeah, as a whole, I don't think this is very good. I kind of see how this might work if there were some changes made to it, and outside certain moments, I don't think it's all actively annoying, but I think it needed a bit more firepower, or maybe just a bit more inspiration. I mean, who am I to say, but this was kind of tedious for me to listen to, and considering it's not even a half hour and still feels bloated, that's not a good sign. I'm feeling a 5 out of 10, and I guess if you want one more positive thing for me to say, I did mostly like the closing track, which was better melodically than I was expecting, but I'm probably not going back to this, and it was disappointing considering all the hype. I didn't know what to expect going into this when I saw it getting showered with critical acclaim, but if I'm understanding correctly, I'm pretty sure this is the same person behind the name Sonos Tomam Konta, whose music I've reviewed on my blog back in the day. Although that name is listed as a featured artist on this album, so maybe I'm misunderstanding. And by the way, that is one of a few different names I'm going to try and say in this video that I hope I'm pronouncing properly, and if I'm not, my apologies. But either way, I haven't listened to an album credited to Antropoceno before, and I was very intrigued by this. So looking at the album's Bandcamp page, this is the second album in a trilogy inspired by the work of indigenous rights activist Ailton Krenak, and it blends field recordings from the Amazon with elements of Brazilian folk and mixes them with much heavier genres as well, like post-rock. The Bandcamp page also mentions that this has lyrics in Portuguese, Tupi, and Yoruba, and that the album, to quote it, recontextualizes candomblé and capoeira chants through an idiosyncratic sound palette developed to create a dialogue between ancestrality and futurism. Most of that is word for word. And it also says that this album challenges anthropocentric views of the world that conceive humanity as an organism separate from the body of the earth, and that it promotes an ontological realignation with nature. That's a lot of quoting from its Bandcamp page, so I guess I should share some of my own thoughts on the album, but I wanted to say all that for context, and I did not want to try and put it in my own words. And this should also come with a bit of a disclaimer that a lot of these lyrics I could not find translations for. It says I can find English translations by downloading the album, but I'm not totally sure how to do that, and I also don't know if it'll cost me anything. And I do have a harder time really feeling emotionally moved by lyrics that aren't in the language I understand, even if I can read accurate translations, which is not a criticism of the album, it's just me saying it's harder for me to really love or even just analyze the lyrics that are in a language I don't understand. I did see some of the translations for this, but I couldn't find all of them. But I also understand the general idea of this album because of what I read about it, which I mentioned earlier, and I guess I'll just say take this review with a huge grain of salt. I don't think I'm even close to fully understanding this project, and it puts me in an interesting place as a critic to try and give constructive opinions on it. But look, at the end of the day, as much as I'm a critic, or at least I like to think of myself as one, just like any music critic, I'm just a guy who likes music and wants to talk about the music that I listen to. I can't say objectively how good or bad any album is, and no critic can do that whether they want to or not. So for me, yeah, I ended up really enjoying this album a lot. I really like the blending of different styles, a lot of which are styles you would not expect to go well together, and yet she manages to pull this off quite well. There are even passages of black metal on this album, and it fits despite contrasting the Brazilian folk instrumentation all over this album. It's a really nice fusion of genres that's full of plenty moments that are very pleasant on the ears. These tracks are groovy, often funky, and I think the production is really strong as well. So speaking of the production, it feels so crisp and smooth and really gives the instrumentation breathing room when it needs to, which really helps the vibe of just taking in your surroundings. But when it needs to hit hard, it really does, where the metal passages really just go there with such well-crafted walls of sound that absolutely rock without feeling too messy or even feeling super out there, which I think for this album is kind of impressive considering how the genres are blended. Look, I'm cool with quirky music, but this album manages to blend these genres in ways that almost makes you forget what unique genre blending there is because it's just done so seamlessly. But the moment that really struck me the most was the penultimate track, with its storytelling, which might be done by an elder family member, I'm not sure, but whoever it is who is speaking mentions trying to make it to 100 and also talks about their grandfather who died at 102 years old in 1977. Keep in mind, I'm just assuming the translation I did online is accurate because I copy-pasted the lyrics and translated them. And after all the feelings of nostalgia described, we get a story about a rural exodus in Brazil many decades ago because agribusinesses wanted room for their operations, which led a lot of people to starve because they weren't in a place where they could access food like they had been before. And the overall message of the track seems to be that we've just come to accept horrible realities like this rather than fighting against them. And we can only make change if we dream bigger. But there also does seem to be a theme of engaging with the earth directly as it is, and how that could help if we maybe looked backwards a little bit in that way. And I hope I properly got across everything that I was trying to say, because sometimes I do wonder if I'm choosing all my words as well as I'd like to. I guess if I were to try and reword it, we need to be able to look forward, but also look back at certain things that might have worked. And back to the album as a whole. Well, yeah, it's legitimately great, and I can see why it's getting so much acclaim, which I think is totally deserved. It might be a bit of an acquired taste for some, and I'll admit it took me a few listens before it really started to click for me this much, but I'm so glad it did. If you can't tell already, I think it's an 8 out of 10, and I cannot recommend it enough. I don't know all the lyrical references, and it's one of many reasons why I think there's probably a lot more here that I'm missing, and even that track that I talked in a bit more detail about, I could be misunderstanding some of the messaging of it a little bit. I don't think I am, but I could be. But I can still confidently call this a great album that I have not heard anything else like in 2026. I had absolutely no idea what to expect from this underground melodic black metal band based in Germany, as I've never listened to or even heard of this band before, as far as I can remember. And it doesn't even seem like they're particularly popular, as far as I know. I was just looking at new album releases, and I came across this, and I was just like, whatever, I may as well give it a shot. I mean, I like sometimes listening to albums that most people are probably going to have never heard of before. And this album is certainly interesting, to say the least. It takes an approach to black metal that's quite different from what I usually hear. Now, first, here's another disclaimer about a language barrier, as the lyrics to this album are in German, and thus I can't totally understand them as well as I would be able to if I understood German, even though I translated them online. But if I were to comment on them briefly, I'll start by mentioning the album's Bandcamp description. This review is kind of similar to the one I did right before it. And the Bandcamp description for this album talks about a metaphorical mill that, to quote that description I read, promises shelter, control, and mastery over oneself, while at the same time draining what is most vital and severing the individual from their own inner source. And yeah, I can absolutely see that in a lot of the lyrics on this album, along with multiple moments that feel like the narrator desperately trying to find human connection to cling on to, but just feels fucked over by systems time and time again, and also maybe by people who are dishonest as well. Beyond what I read about it on Bandcamp, though, anything else I say about it is just my interpretation. but I cannot deny how harshly real and terrifying this feels. And on that note, yeah, I think this album basically represents pure horror and fear in music form, where it might be one of the most terrifying albums that I've heard in 2026. But okay, now that I've said that, I do want to make sure I don't overhype this too much, because if you're not a fan of black metal, then this is not going to be for you. I'll talk a little bit more about the genre and its potential accessibility or lack thereof to a pop audience in the last mini review in this video, but for now I'll just say it's obviously a genre that's got its fans and also has got its non-fans, and if I were to try and recommend a black metal album to a non-fan of the genre as an introduction, it certainly would not be this one. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot about this that really stood out to me and grabbed my attention, but it's not really blending it with other genres or doing anything that might grab the attention of someone who isn't already into metal. Or maybe it would, who am I to say? But it's probably unlikely compared to some other black metal albums I can think of that might be better gateways. And no, I'm not going to say this is the most amazing album I've ever heard, but I did end up liking it a lot more than I thought I would. I mean, it was just a random black metal album I found online, and yet it turned out to be so much more. So what makes this album so interesting, beyond what I mentioned about the lyrics? Well, I think the music matches the poetry quite well. Again, if I'm interpreting the lyrics properly, but even if I'm not, I can still interpret them in my own way. And it uses some interesting synths that you might expect to feel a bit out of place on this kind of metal album, but they actually add to the spookiness of it quite a bit. There's also some real unexpected twists, like how the closing track is just a mellow piano piece, which isn't my favorite moment on the album, but is still a pretty haunting way for it to end. And there's also some interesting sudden changes in tempo, intensity, and also just the overall vibe of the riffs and grooves. And again, I think it's just an absolutely punishing listen that really brings a feeling of fear through the music alone, and the harsh vocals are absolutely incredible to fit this vibe and make it feel so much more intense. So I guess if I were to give this a rating, well, I'm not sure I totally love it enough all the way through to fully shower this with praise as much as I'd like to, but I will still give it a light 8 out of 10 because it did impress me a lot and I'm still enjoying it very much. I just can't say fully that it's completely blowing my mind or anything. Still, it's some pretty solid black metal that has a lot of unpredictability, and I think it makes pretty damn good use of it and all its strengths. And in a year that's been kind of underwhelming for black metal when it comes to the stuff that I've been listening to, this was a nice surprise, and I'm really glad I found it. And just like that album that I just talked about, here's another album I just randomly came across when looking for new releases online, although this one is in a very different genre. I'd probably call this alternative rock if I had to come up with an easy genre description for it, but there definitely seems to be some kind of concept going on throughout, which makes it easy to forget when I'm not actively listening to it at the time that I'm thinking about it, that it's in a lot of ways kind of the stereotypical alternative rock album. Although again, there's more to it that I'm gonna at least try to talk about. But anyways, who are Kit Bash? Well, they're an American band who formed a few years ago, this being their second album, and I still have not listened to their first. But other than that, I barely know anything about them. Sometimes I just like to listen to music that I don't see getting much attention, as I mentioned in the previous review right before this one. Which is why I decided to review this, just like the album I just discussed. And what's interesting about this album is that right from the start of the opening track, the first words on this album are, and I'm gonna read these lyrics, it's in kind of a spoken word form, it says, "It's amazing, isn't it, how your awareness grows as you hear the truth of these words. They may sound abstract, but there is nothing more real, more useful, and more practical than uncovering your true nature. Its power is incredible, and it's yours for the taking. You can change your life more effortlessly, more efficiently, more rapidly than you can change your clothes." And then, from that point on, if I'm hearing it all correctly, I think the rest of it is, "Audio cassettes make change particularly easy. You can listen to times that might otherwise have been wasted, like sitting on the freeway in traffic, driving around town doing errands, or doing chores around the house. Simply by listening at your convenience, you can be freed from old concepts, old ideas, old notions, and old beliefs that have held you back in the past, just by listening." Now, I'm not sure if that's all original poetry or if it's a sample or a quoting of something, but it definitely hints that there's more going on in this album beneath the surface, and it seems to be trying to provoke some sort of new understanding in the listener. And some of those vocal sections continue a little bit later. I think it was in this track. At some point, I forget which song it was, but it does continue. And on the first two tracks, I really liked the musical energy that this was bringing, with such solid guitar distortion and a really solid groovy sound. And while I'm not sure either of these songs are really going to stick with me, they were fun to kick off the album and made me excited to hear where this was going, even though I didn't really find much resonance for me in the lyrics. But then the sound of the album eventually starts to get a bit stale, as I feel like there's just not much in the way of the uniqueness in the sound, nor are there a lot of standout melodies. It doesn't really feel that unique. And in a lot of ways, it just feels like a typical alternative rock album, even though I think they're trying to aim a higher concept with this and maybe put in their own little quirks to give this more pop appeal, but a lot of it doesn't really feel that interesting. But still, with all that being said, I can still say they mostly do the sound well. The melodies are not half bad either, even if I wish they stood out a bit more. And even if it doesn't really emotionally resonate with me much, it's a mostly fun time, I'll give it credit for that. But when it comes to the overall concept, well, I very well could be missing something, but it's just not gripping me all that much. A lot of it feels very random, with a bunch of seemingly unrelated references, and yeah, there's probably some way that they could all be connected, but the general vibe I get from this is trying to really make the most out of life, while also accepting that there's always going to be existential questions that we can't escape. And we can try and discover as much as possible, but there will always be so much that we can't figure out. I could absolutely be wrong about this. Maybe I'm paying a bit too much attention to that spoken word thing that starts the album. But if that is what this is about, well, I don't know. I'd kind of like the music to have a bit more freeing of a feeling rather than just being kind of generic without having a whole lot to really make it stand out aside from a couple moments that fit quite well for whatever this is trying to do. And there are some moments where it just totally falls flat, like Moonlit Rogue with its really stiff percussion and underpowered guitars. And don't get me wrong, I do like some of these moments. I mentioned the first two tracks, and then there are also some nice instrumental tracks like Sun Hunters Part 2, and especially Beach Day, the latter of which definitely brings some nice summer vibes, and on one of my listens through this album, I got to this song while looking outside at the nice sunny weather. And some of the melodies are pleasant, even if it's not totally wowing me. So you know what, I will give it a 7 out of 10, especially because I think it ends pretty well with Broken Mirror. I really like the line, "Memories of broken mirror, revenants of us appear, but nobody seems the same." This song also has some nice chords that are used quite well, but I'm just not totally wowed by this as a whole. But you know what, as much as I've been complaining about it often sounding kind of generic, there's enough cool things I can point to about this album, where at the end of it, I'm kind of realizing it is probably worth hearing. So yeah, I would recommend it, but I just would not set your expectations too high if I were you. This is the second studio album from this American alternative rock band whom I hadn't heard of until recently, and I decided to check out their 2023 debut just cause why not? And I'm glad I did because it's great. It's the kind of punchy alternative rock that goes really hard, and in a lot of ways it reminded me a lot of Boston Manor with the huge anthemic qualities and some of the guitar distortion and the pairing of that with the drums, and I really liked a lot of the melodies. So I had good reason to be excited about this new album. And once again, we get a lot of heaviness in the guitar and drums, and there's some screamed vocals on songs like Peace of Mind, Hesitate, What You're Whispering, and probably others that I forgot to mention. And it feels like it blends post-hardcore with emo and other kinds of alternative rock, and it often feels like a very popified version of that sound without sacrificing the heaviness. I'm not sure if that totally makes sense, but if you hear it, you'll probably hear what I mean. And while this is not the most out there thing you're ever gonna hear, not even close, it does feel like they're at least trying to create their own distinct sound, but unfortunately I don't think this is as strong as their debut, and it feels a bit more like a typical alt-rock album than I was hoping, and it might not warrant a lot of replay value for me. And it's kind of frustrating because a lot of the grooves and guitar riffs feel like they should be hitting a lot harder. In other words, I think there's seeds of a great album here, but it feels a little too eaten up by its own problems to fully click as much as I'd like. Almost like said seeds grow into the ground. But my bad attempts at being funny aside, it's tricky to fully figure out what possibly could have been done to save an album like this, because a lot of the elements that I like about it also feel like they kind of hold it back for me. Like how the vocals are a strong aspect of it in a lot of ways, but I also don't think the vocals always totally fit the vibe. The biggest example is that some of these tracks feel kinda awkward with the contrast of the super heavy instrumentation with some softer vocals that I don't think totally fit, like on songs such as What You're Whispering, Weight of the Truth, Diversion, and Focus. Or I could also mention that as much as I like a lot of the riffs and the overall style they're aiming for, it feels like it maybe takes up too much of the focus of the album beyond having a bit more to it for a fully great album. I don't know, it's hard to explain. But I guess that does bring me to the lyrics, which might be a bit easier to talk about properly. And there's absolutely some emotional appeal of an album like this, with a lot of existential dread and questioning all your surroundings, or maybe even just trying to claw your way out of a long period of malaise and angst. And there are also some moments that feel a bit different, like the heartbreaking "You're Not Making Sense," which might be talking about a loved one who passed away, or maybe just someone the narrator lost touch with. And I don't think the overall lyrics of this album are bad at all, and it kind of makes sense for an album like this, where there's a constant back and forth between atmospheric moments and full-on heaviness. But I'm also not going to say I was blown away by the lyrics, where it feels like it would have worked a lot better if the music itself was more consistent. All this being said, I do absolutely think there's some solid moments on this album. Used to Be is definitely a highlight with its killer groove and production that mostly backs it up, even if certain parts of that song feel a little underpolished. I could also highlight the intriguing motion of the guitar notes of Diversion that brings some nice crunch, the punishing relentlessness of Hesitate, the way Death to a Past Life completely switches up the vibe and pretty much goes full-on pop-punk with a really fast tempo and sounds really good, the good use of contrast in musical styles on Chosen Brother, and even though I'm not a huge fan of the closing track Focus, it does have some pretty kick-ass instrumentation in the chorus. But I guess if I had to simply define why this album doesn't totally work for me, it's that too many moments feel like they didn't have a clear vision, and it's especially not helped when the occasional moment just doesn't have much going for it at all, like Fall Away, which feels like the instrumentation just has no breathing room, and it all just sounds squished together in the production, and it's not even one of the catchier songs here. And the following track, Comforting, feels like one of the most uninteresting moments melodically, even if I like a lot of the notes that the singer hits. Although that song also suffers from some underwhelming production sometimes, like the shots of instrumentation at the end that don't have nearly the impact that I think they're supposed to. But I can also realize a lot of this probably sounds more negative than I'm meaning for it to come across, because I do like a lot of this album quite a bit. So yeah, it's maybe not fully my thing, and outside a couple of songs I probably won't be returning to it much, but it is still going to get a 7 out of 10 for doing a lot of things really well. And it doesn't make me super worried about the quality of future projects from the band, as I'm still pretty excited to hear more from them, but this was a little disappointing, even though I still think it's quite good. Well, this is a big release, both in terms of amount of buzz this has been getting and amount of anticipation for this release, and also in being over 70 minutes long. And I'm really happy that Raye has finally been able to release music independently after her label wouldn't let her release her debut album for so long. So we got that debut in 2023 with My 21st Century Blues. I really liked that album, and I was surprised by the amount of acclaim that this new one has been getting, so I had good reason to be optimistic about this album. And this one seems to be aiming even higher, continuing with some of the themes from that album, albeit with more emphasis on breakups and bad relationships, and done with a more musical theater-like presentation. And unfortunately, I don't really think it works. And it's so disappointing. I really thought I was going to like this a lot more, especially because I really liked her debut, but I also feel like I should not be that surprised, considering how much more emphasis there is on the skits and spoken word passages on this album, which were on her debut, and it kind of worked due to not feeling overly prevalent, but this album absolutely has the feeling of a concept album, even though I'm not totally sure what the overall concept even is. I much preferred the collection of stories of My 21st Century Blues, where the tone of each song felt fitting, and really made the songs come to life more for happy and sad moments, sometimes a mix of both, and it all came together into a project that felt way more real and honest. And I hate using that as a critique about this album, because I'm guessing there's a lot of personal experiences that went into this, but just simply from a listener's perspective, it feels very generic at a lot of points, and like it's trying way too hard to be some kind of epic, motivational album, and thus, even if there was a lot of heart put into this, it unfortunately doesn't really shine through that much. And there's so many examples that I think perfectly sum up what I'm talking about. I Know You're Hurting feels like just another attempt at a motivational anthem that, at least to me, feels very uninspiring. Honestly, the same thing could be said about Lifeboat, which comes next in the track list. And then there's the lead single, Where Is My Husband, that feels like the most obnoxious song ever written about romantic loneliness. Or I could point to Beware the South London Lover Boy, which is a very odd song. And I absolutely agree with her message here for women to be careful when walking home after dark, but the presentation of it is honestly kind of cringe, as it feels like it switches from a song about a toxic relationship to suddenly trying to act as some kind of educational song. I mean, I guess I cannot blame her for spreading an important message, but it's still not a good song at all. And I'm sorry, but I just don't feel the emotion at all in Goodbye Henry. For this kind of melodramatic breakup song, you've got to be able to sell it. And it just kind of is honestly kind of embarrassing, as there's basically nothing to this song, and yet it's over 5 minutes. Or I guess there might be something to the instrumentation, but it's certainly not gripping me. I will admit the vocal flow of Skin and Bones leads to one of the better songs here. I also like a lot of the horns on I Will Overcome, which really helped that song in its huge scope musically, and it's one of the few moments where those attempts don't feel overblown. And Winter Woman is really good melodically, and the emotion really shines through in its heartbroken lovesickness, which is emphasized by the sadness all throughout the sound of it that you can really feel through the music alone. And going back to the lyrics, I guess Click Clack Symphony is probably one of my favorite moments in that regard, even if there are some corny lines, because at its core, it's a song about those moments where you feel like you've hit rock bottom, but you gotta just put on a happy face because it feels like the only thing that can help. As she says, we don't settle for depression on a Friday night. And while there are some good messages on this album, there's barely any more moments that really stood out to me lyrically for being at all interesting. And overall, this album just feels like an overblown musical drama, which is really too bad because I'm quite confident there's real emotion here, and an attempt at making a very personal album that probably means a lot to Raye. So I really wish the album felt a lot more deserving of such grand instrumentation. And I haven't really talked much about the vocals, so on that note, well, Raye is a very impressive singer, I don't think anyone can deny that, but I just wish her singing fit the vibe more. As it is, the whole thing just doesn't feel like it can make any sort of larger concept work, if there even is one on this project. There are some moments of good writing or production or delivery, and the song with her grandfather was cute even if I'm not going back to it. But as an album, talk about a disappointment. There's just too many spoken word passages and endless meta-commentary that doesn't really feel justified. When 21 Pilots did that on their album Blurry Face, they had a much quirkier sense of humor and knew how to make it fit within the songs. Here it's just cringe and unflattering for this album. And when it gets to the liner notes at the end, which did not need to be included as part of the album itself, I just mentally check out. So I thought I was going to have to give this a light 5 out of 10, but even that feels kind of nice because the album is so goddamn bloated. I guess I mainly just respect the ambition. So you know what? Strong 4 out of 10, and I hate doing that because her debut was legitimately really good. So yeah, possibly one of the biggest disappointments thus far in 2026, although again, part of me feels like I maybe shouldn't be this surprised. But I also could not have predicted it being this much of a mess. So I skipped doing a Charlie Puth discography dive before this album. I remember listening to his debut album a while ago and thinking it absolutely sucked, but I also know some people say he's gotten better, and others say that he's continued to make bad music. I'm not super familiar with his discography outside of a bunch of his singles, most of which I don't really like that much, but he's got a few that I think are okay. So I wanted to give this a fair shot, but I was not going to waste too much time on it. And, well, okay, it's not that bad. But it's also just a pretty average pop album, although it's absolutely got the feeling of pop star who hasn't been at peak popularity for years now and is desperately trying to be quirky and unique to appeal to a certain audience. And honestly, I can't really blame him for that, especially because Charlie Puth has always seemed very passionate about music. I just wish it led this to be a better album. For my first big observation on this album, why does Beat Yourself Up sound like Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley? Are we getting rickrolled by Charlie Puth in 2026? But okay, jokes aside, it actually does remind me a lot of that song. Also, on another side note, why is the song called Beat Yourself Up when the whole point of the song is Don't Beat Yourself Up? I don't know, that probably could have been thought out better. But whatever, how's the album? Well, the production is pretty good, and I like a lot of the messages, but they don't really feel that unique, nor do the songs really make up for that. I like the smooth production of Home, which is a nice song dedicated to his wife. Don't Meet Your Heroes is a simple yet mostly effective track for what it's trying to do, and I think the title tells you all you need to know about what kind of song this is. And I also quite like the vocals of Cry that really help the emotion shine through and leads to one of the better songs in this album. And on that note, I guess I should talk about Charlie Puth as a singer. And honestly, it's another one of those cases where I cannot deny his impressive vocal abilities, but I don't really love his vocal style most of the time, similar to Raye on that last album I just talked about. And I'm not just talking about this album, just in general with Charlie Puth from what I've heard. Sometimes he can find certain notes that really fit for the song, but even if he's a great singer from a technical perspective, I just can't say I really enjoy listening to it that much. Although to his credit, there's way less insufferable moments here vocally than I was expecting. I just am not all that wowed in a positive way either. But despite this being much better than I expected, or at least a little bit better than I expected, it's just not an album I'm excited about, nor can I really recommend it much. I think Charlie Puth reached a level of popularity where it doesn't really matter how much he falls off, he's still going to have his audience, and I guess I'm just not in said audience. I think this is mostly fine, and there are other moments that were kinda nice that I didn't even talk about either, such as the end of Sideways with those strings and vocals, and other moments here that are oddly kinda charming, but emphasis on kinda, and other moments just feel way too try-hard in the attempts at quirkiness or uniqueness, or maybe some kind of relatability. Prime example for all of that is New Jersey. And I also don't really like that really obnoxious Michael McDonald feature on Love in Exile. And back toward positivity, I'm lying if I say the closing track, I Used to Be Cringe, isn't kinda cute. Also, the penultimate track, Until It Happens to You, is the sort of weirdly jolly song that takes some depressing themes of fear and tragedy, and manages to not make it feel too weirdly contrasting. I mean, the song is largely based on the line, I woke up, heard the bad news, thank God I'm not in your shoes, and it feels like the sort of song that's likely to end up as a bad attempt at empathy, and yet it actually kind of works, and I'm shocked he was able to kind of pull this off. It's not a great song by any means, but I'm surprised it's not awful. But yeah, for me, that kind of sums up the album, where I'm just surprised it's not a whole lot worse. So for me, it's a 6 out of 10, definitely not a bad album by any means, and even though Charlie Puth has typically been an artist that critics just absolutely can't stand, I'm not going to pretend this is awful just because it's cool to not like Charlie Puth albums. But I also don't love this, and I think there's a lot better music out there that's probably way more worth your time. So I did not spend too much time on this one, and I'm just going to leave it at that. Alright, for the last review of this video, here's a black metal album that I saw getting a lot of acclaim, but I can't find any lyrics for it, and thus, as always with this kind of situation, I just gotta make it about the music itself. And one thing that I absolutely hate is hearing a black metal album and feeling like it's helping me understand why some people just can't get into the genre at all. I was recently thinking about this the other day. I will often recommend a really great metal album to people who don't like metal just to see if I can expand their musical taste, and almost all the time it doesn't work, where if they even listen to it, they'll end up not liking it at all. And that's totally valid. Different people like different things. But I'll often still have the thought of, how could you not like this? It's going through my head. Even though that's probably what a lot of people think about albums that I might not really like, especially in genres that I'm not a big fan of, even if it's a genre that they really like, or a genre that's really widely appreciated and adored. Now, I do think pretty much every genre has its good and bad stuff, but as someone who actually really likes a lot of black metal, and I like the genre overall, this one feels like it puts me on that other side of the metal argument about whether it just sounds like noise or not, of which I'll usually say it doesn't. And okay, I'm not gonna say this is just noise. There are melodies, it's got a lot of the same musicality that most black metal albums do, and I can absolutely make out the instruments. It's not even like a death metal album or anything where it's just endless intensity. And it's got black metal vocals, but the problem for me is said vocals are kind of annoying to listen to. Maybe they just don't really fit with the instrumentation and the production, I'm not sure. I haven't totally figured out why it doesn't work for me. But it's a real shame, especially in moments like the third track, Blue Blades, Flame and Crimson, which actually has some pretty decent melodies and production otherwise, but the vocals just don't work for me at all, and it's hard to fully explain why. But I guess there's also the issue of production for me on most of the album. There's this weird feeling of disconnect between the instruments, where the drums often feel too messy to really have any punch, the bass feels like it doesn't provide much of a foundation, and while the guitars are probably the best sounding instrument here in terms of timbre and production, they can only do so much work by themselves. And just to be clear, this isn't a complaint about the musicianship itself, it's just that the whole thing just sounds so messy that it doesn't really have any impact for me. And again, it doesn't help that I don't really like the growly vocals. The album ends with a nearly 15-minute closing track, which starts off sounding like a specific track from Deafheaven's newest album, although it's also probably just a common riff melody that Deafheaven happened to use a lot better. But anyway, in this mellow intro, I get no feeling of real atmosphere. And a few tracks earlier on this album, there was some nice atmosphere in a mellower section, but here it just feels bland and dull. And while I like the subtle snare that helps it build a little bit, it doesn't solve this passage's overall problem. And I was expecting some sudden hit of instrumentation, as it would all get so much heavier just in a second, which would have been predictable, but I'll at least take it over what we got, because after that boring intro that's nearly 6 minutes long, the instrumentation comes in with a lot less power than I was expecting, and you can totally see it coming too. It just doesn't hit just out of nowhere. And look, that would have been cool if it could actually sound more impactful, but once again, it's got the same problem that most of the album does. And if you can't tell, I'm really not much of a fan of this album. And it's really disappointing because I saw this getting a lot of acclaim, so I thought we could be in for some kick-ass black metal. Instead, we got this album that I don't hate, but I certainly don't like it either. It's getting a 5 out of 10. I don't think it's awful, and there was one track I mostly liked, but the whole album has issues for me that hold it back. If you can get past the vocals and the messy production, there might be a lot to like here, but this just did not wow me. Alright, I feel kind of out of breath after doing all that talking, and this is probably going to take a while to edit, and yeah, I'm not sure exactly when this video is going to be posted. But anyway, thank you for watching. Yeah, the next couple mini review videos are not going to be as in-depth as this one is. They're probably going to be very, very brief. But anyway, with all that being said, thank you for watching, and feel free to let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of these albums and or what you thought of my video. And yeah, I think that's all I got to say for now. Thank you for watching. I will see you all later.